Good evening all, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Well, over the last couple of days the news has been dominated by the announcement that there will be £386 million a week put into the NHS, a well needed funding boost for our health service. This seems to have upset quite a few of the Remain campaigners who have been going around for the last 2 years complaining about a slogan on the side of a battle bus. And the 386 million is more than 350 million a week that was allegedly pledged. It wasn't. It actually said let's fund our own priorities like the NHS instead, but never let the reality get in the way of a good slogan. So 386 million a week, great, or so it appears on the face of it. Now, don't let me sound like a Grinch here. I'll leave that to the IFS, who've turned round once again and said that there will be no Brexit dividend to put into the NHS, as the Prime Minister has announced. Well, excuse me if I don't take the IFS very seriously, because every prediction that they've made since the referendum on fiscal matters has been drastically wrong. I'm sure it's got nothing to do with the fact that 10% of their overall funding comes from Brussels. That's your money, by the way, just funneled through the Brussels bureaucrats and then back to an organisation that parrots the EU's line. But hey, you know, maybe I'm being picky. So that money, yes, we agree the NHS needs to be supported, but I don't know. At the moment, we're always hearing from Labour politicians that it's being starved of funding, there are cuts, but in actual financial terms, there's more money going into the NHS now than there ever has been. So why have we got such a problem with services? Well, there are a number of reasons that we can look at. Firstly, under the Labour government, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown decided to prop up the NHS using Private Finance Initiative, PFI. So they basically borrowed money to put into the NHS, but that money was borrowed in such a way that it was kept off the books. So it didn't look as if they were actually borrowing more money than they really were. And the real kicker is that the private companies that they borrowed the money from, well, they've got to pay them back. But that 50 billion that they put in will cost, over the course of the 30 or 40 years of the deals, the British taxpayer 300 billion. You could have got a better deal from Wonga. And of course there are certain big businessmen who are standing there rubbing their hands thinking, yeah, we've done well out of this. And then of course there's procurement. You only have to look at some of the bits that were put into the PFI initiatives regarding the new hospitals going up and the maintenance contracts. So in some cases it costs £150 to change a light bulb that I can go down to my local discount store and buy for £1. So again, there are a lot of anomalies like that. And it's not just with the maintenance, it's also with the pharmaceuticals, because the crazy thing about the NHS is you would think, as the largest healthcare customer in the world, that a big organisation like that would get the very, very best deal for what they buy, but they don't. You're looking at aspirin being charged massive amounts of money to the NHS. You can go and buy 20 Nurofen for under £1 down the chemist. The NHS is paying 20 times that. So the procurement needs to be looked at. They need to get a grip on that. Then there are some of the things that were changed under Blair. So you've got things like the GP surgery contracts, where no more were the GP surgeries run by the NHS. They were actually run by the doctors who were in the practice, which meant they had to take on extra staff to process paperwork, which costs money. That money then gets billed back to the NHS by the practices. So that's put an extra layer of bureaucracy on, but at the same time there are people who run those surgeries who've done very nicely out of it. And yes, Labour Assembly member for Hillingdon and Ealing, Dr. Onka Sahota, I'm looking at you. Your two surgeries that you've got locally bill the NHS in excess of £1 million a year. And it's a private company, Healthcare 360 Limited. So you're making all this nice money out of the NHS, and please don't say it's costing you all that to actually run the service, because you don't get 12 properties and counting in your name if you're not making a nice fat profit out of it. So there are people there making money out of GP surgery contracts to the detriment of the patients. And at the same time, of course, you do have those that are run on a shoestring and run tight and close to budget. It means that the doctors are taken off the front line to do the additional paperwork. So we've got an issue there. We've also got the fact that Labour massively increased the amount of admin staff. So the admin staff, the amount now of admin staff compared to frontline staff is way out of kilter compared to what it was before. And shame on the Conservatives for not actually doing something about that, because you've also got quangos like the CQC who are overseeing things with people on big bloated wages, again paid for by the taxpayer. So you've got a lot of things there you can look into. There are efficiencies that can be made that do not affect the front line. So the hint that some of the new funding will come out of the Brexit dividend and the rest of it out an increase in tax. Let's have a look at the efficiency side of this first, guys, because it's the front line that's been struggling. The back room hasn't been, and that's the non-productive part of the NHS. Then, of course, we come on to the big elephant in the room, which is, why is there so much demand on NHS services? Well, that's because of population increases. More people means you need more hospitals, more doctors, more staff. And of course, our population is going up at the moment at the rate of 500,000 people a year. The vast majority of that increase in population comes from mass uncontrolled migration. So you are looking at nearly 500,000 people, and even if it coming into the country every year, and okay, the net figure's lower, it was about 250,000 last year where people are leaving, but you've still got 250,000 increase and 500,000 new people coming in. And it's also a fact of life, I'm afraid, that when you have people coming in from different countries, there are different standards in those countries, and as a result, some people come in with afflictions that we've eradicated here. So, for instance, TB, we've seen a massive rise in TB, and that's been reintroduced after it was almost eradicated, because we have migrants coming in from countries that have a TB issue, and under EU regulations they can come in. We don't necessarily have to check them, and they're entitled to service here under European Union regulation. You have to treat an EU citizen the same as a UK citizen. So you've got that extra demand on, which the only way, of course, that we can deal with we're looking at dealing with the supply problem, but until you deal with the demand problem, which is the same with housing, until you deal with the demand problem, then of course you're going to have to spend money, of course you're going to have to increase supply, because the demand goes up. That's a basic rule of economics in anything: healthcare, housing, roads, schools. You have a bigger population, then you've got to put more money in to pay for it. But unfortunately, we're getting a bigger population without the infrastructure going in, and of course, because there's an oversupply in the labour market, and the unskilled labour market, that is, then that's brought down the actual price of labour. People are seeing their wages compressed at the bottom end, and as a result, there are more people but less tax being paid. But what about the ageing population, I hear you ask? What about the smokers who are putting all the pressure on? Well, the ageing population worked and paid their national insurance for years. They've paid their way. That's the whole idea. That's why it's called national insurance. You're paying money into an insurance pot, and when you need it, it's there. So turning around and saying we've got an ageing population and blaming the elderly when they're the ones who've paid in all their lives is frankly ridiculous. And as far as smokers go, well, I've got to put my hands up, I'm afraid. Yes, I'm a smoker. Have a look at the tax on cigarettes. The tax that's on cigarettes, smokers pay in far more in tax into the NHS through the duties on tobacco than they take in treatments. And of course, we're doing the decent thing and shortening our lifespan, so we're dying younger, so we're less of a pressure anyway. That's a little joke there before anybody gets all politically correct and upset. But the basic reality is we live shorter lives, and we're paying a lot more tax, so that's covered. So, what do we do with the NHS? Yes, the money's welcome, but there are ways that we can save money. So, in terms of savings on the NHS, let's renegotiate the GP surgery contracts. Let's look at buying out and renegotiating the PFI contracts, and let's start training our own staff so that we don't have to go around pillaging the rest of the world for much needed health staff from their countries. Let's train our own, put them in, take some people off the dole queue as well while we're doing it, and that will also mean that we won't have to pay fortunes in agency staff. And the agency staff cost the NHS a lot of money. In fact, a couple of years ago in Hillingdon, there was a report that showed that they paid 1.5 million in agency staff in a 3-month period, which would have been 600,000 if they'd have been full-time employed by the NHS. So whilst I welcome the money going into the NHS, I'm sorry, but let's get the efficiencies sorted out. Let's cut the quangos, let's cut the pen pushers, and when that money goes in, let's make sure it goes to the front line where it's needed. Thanks very much.